Thank you so much, Giuseppe, and thank you so much for your lovely workshop that you organized that I found extremely stimulating and enjoyable. And I'm very honored to have been invited to this. And thank you all for coming this morning. So let's get started. Mind shaping, the basic idea behind mind shaping, the term was coined by Matteo Mameli, who is a philosopher at the University of London. Way back in 2001, this is where I, first encountered it. And he had this idea that, and this is an idea I think that Barry was talking about this kind of social niche building among human beings. So niche building is a concept, relatively new concept in biology, where the idea is that if you have sort of non-genetic inheritance mechanisms, you can find cases where rather than adapt to a niche, animals can adapt niches to themselves. So Mameli gives this example of a butterfly species that imprints on the leaves on which it's hatched such that it lays its eggs on leaves of the same species. And then one individual, there's a misfire and they lay their eggs on a different species, which just so happens to be more nutritious. And that individual has more offspring, and those offspring then imprint on that new species. Now here we have a change in ecological niche without a genetic change, right? So that's the sort of basic concept in biology. And Mameli proposes to apply this to the much more sophisticated case of human societies, where we can actually alter our social niches through various mechanisms of non-genetic inheritance. And he focuses on the phenomenon of social expectancy. So here's the example he gives in the human case. There's this evidence that infants who present, the same infant when presenting as male versus female due to the clothes they put on the infant, they may engage in the same behavior, but the behavior is interpreted differently depending on perceived gender. So if the child is very fussy and it's a boy, they tend to be interpreted as angry. If it's a girl, it tends to be interpreted as upset. And so Mameli proposes, sort of conjectures, as speculation, that these attributions of mental states, upset versus angry, can then lead into self-fulfilling prophecies because the infants grow to conform to what's expected of them. And that's a kind of social niche building made possible through the attribution of mental states to infants. So that's Mameli's kind of conjecture, and that's where the sort of idea of mind shaping is born. But there were other anticipations of the idea, most prominently from the Canadian philosopher, I mean, she's at Princeton now, Victoria McGeer, who in a number of publications argued that our folk psychology has a regulative function. So when we attribute mental states to ourselves and others, we're not merely describing their behavioral dispositions or the brain state they happen to be in. We are imposing a kind of regulative framework, and that comes with normative expectations. So if you say that you intend to do P, it's more than just a description of what's going on through your head. There's a set of expectations about what you should do in light of having said that. So these are some anticipations of mind shaping. When I was exploring this concept, I had in mind a whole palette of possible mechanisms of this kind of social niche building or mind shaping. One mechanism that has been studied very extensively by one of the people in the audience, Michael Tomasello, is imitation. And there's this interesting variant that is, seems to distinguish humans from most other species called over-imitation, where infants, children will tend to imitate the precise means by which someone accomplishes a goal, even if they know of a more efficient way of doing it, because what matters is getting the precise method correct. Another way of shaping people is through pedagogy. There are rudimentary examples of pedagogy in other species, but no other species approaches the human obsession with teaching offspring, both through explicit instruction, but more like the master apprentice style of learning skills is, a cultural universal. Culture more generally, norm, institution, and enforcement, which we've talked a lot about. These are all possible mechanisms of social niche construction or mind shaping. However, I didn't want to focus on these because they're extremely controversial. Anyone who's read on this, there's been, gallons of ink spilt on what exactly a norm is, what exactly pedagogy is. What I was interested in is in what all of these have in common from a kind of evolutionary perspective. So I used Mameli's term mind shaping as a kind of umbrella term for any practice or mechanism that shapes minds to make us more easily interpretable by others shaped similarly. Okay, so any mechanism that does that. All right, so that's the basic idea. Now it's an idea that has been explored in philosophy, sociology, psychology for centuries. So Aristotle had this very interesting concept of second nature. So our first nature is the nature we're born with, our innate natural endowment. But according to Aristotle, there's also a second nature, which involves the development of character and moral habits through practice and education, which become as ingrained and natural as first nature. Education plays a crucial role in this, and it's closely linked to our ability to reason, according to Aristotle. Another anticipation or oh, can I have the mouse there? Yeah, very nice. Yeah, okay. So another example is, Jonathan Lear has this wonderful book called A Case for Irony from 2011, where he draws on Kierkegaard's distinction between Christendom and Christianity, and Christendom being the sort of socially acceptable expression of Christianity, which Kierkegaard was a big critic of and didn't think it captured the real spirit of Christianity. And so Lear calls this pretense, or putting oneself forward as, making oneself interpretable to one's community. Various notions of ideology proposed by various thinkers are also an example, an anticipation of a kind of mind-shaping mechanism. So you might think of Nietzsche's idea that the feeling of conscience, the feeling of freedom of the will is not really tracking anything real in your mind. It's not a description of what you're doing. It's more of a interpretive tool that makes you interpretable to your community. Heidegger, with all due deference to Heideggerians in the audience, I'm quite an amateur, but I know there's at least one who might take issue with this. But as I understand, the Heidegger's notion of das Man, the they, is the intelligibility of the world as we encounter it in the first instance, structured by socially shared aims, norms, tastes, and standards. In grasping this intelligibility, we act as anyone would. Then the French sociologist Bourdieu has this notion of habitus, which is the learned, often unconscious dispositions and patterns of thought and behavior that individuals internalize through their social experiences. Goffman is another well-known Canadian sociologist who studied this sort of stuff. The presentation of self in everyday life is famous work. He would do things like go on an elevator in Manhattan, and during the morning rush hour, it's filled with businessmen going up, and he would just stand facing backwards, the back of the elevator, just to reveal these sorts of norms we all take for granted, norms of behavior and interaction. And Sally Haslanger more recently has this argument that race and gender are real but not natural categories. They're socially constructed categories that are maintained through these mechanisms of shaping that are socially implemented. So these are some anticipations or earlier versions of the mind shaping hypothesis. I have explored this idea in my 2013 book, Mind Shaping, and then just 2 weeks ago, May 29th, Rutledge released the Rutledge Handbook of Mindshaping, which my co-editor and postdoc Rémi Tizon and I put together with 37 chapters exploring various implications and applications of the concept. So that's sort of the background. Now, let me talk about the motivation. So I think what the work I've been working on brings to this general idea that we shape each other to make each other more interpretable to each other, is to put it in a Darwinian perspective. And the main motivation is the problem of human coordination. This has always struck me as an extremely prominent difference between our species and other species. We can coordinate on complex, long-term cooperative projects with unfamiliar others that are not genetically related to us. And this is sort of, we just take this for granted. It's kind of like the fish, the proverbial fish swimming in water. You know, on your way here today, you may have likely interacted with someone you've never met before, just on the sidewalk. And knowing which way to go in order to pass them on the sidewalk. So we routinely take this for granted. And I forget, Mike was telling me yesterday, but I forget who first proposed this thought experiment. But if you put a bunch of chimpanzees in a transatlantic jet and have them sit down and try, it'll be a bloodbath, right? Whereas we routinely do this, go into subways, buses with people we've never met before, know exactly what to do, no conflict, no violence. So it's astonishing that we're able to do this. And most of our evolutionary advantages come from this ability, right? Our ability to build culture and technology and protect ourselves against predation are all communal coordinative tasks, which often involve long-term projects with people we don't know super well. So that's an amazing ability of ours. And the standard view of what makes this possible is our capacity to correctly represent each other's thoughts. Correct meta representation, metacognition. So the idea is we know what to expect from and how to interact with unfamiliar others because we're so good at inferring the hidden mental causes of their behavior, their beliefs, their desires and intentions. And mind shaping, and at least in my expression of the idea, is motivated by a seemingly intractable challenge to this orthodox view. And that is the holism of the mental and neurocomputational tractability. So I'll get into that in a second. But here are some examples of the orthodox view. So probably the most influential philosophical discussion of coordination is Lewis's 1969 book, Convention. And he's quite explicit that mind reading, knowing what other people are thinking, is the key to human coordination. So here's a quotation. "We may achieve coordination thus. If I know what you believe about matters of fact that determine the likely effects of your alternative actions, and if I know your preferences among possible outcomes, and I know that you possess a modicum of practical rationality, then I can replicate your practical reasoning to figure out what you will probably do so that you can act appropriately." And again, this has had a huge influence, so it seems just to be taken for granted by a lot of contemporary paradigms in empirical developmental psychology. For example, Kovach's study from 2010 that even 7-month-olds have some kind of concept of belief begins with this, as, without argument, as just the framing assumption of the study. Without an ability to infer the other's mental states, society would be hardly imaginable. Social interactions, from collective hunting to playing soccer to criminal justice, critically depend on the ability to infer others' intentions and beliefs. Such abilities are also at the foundation of major evolutionary conundra. For example, the human aptitude at inferring mental states might be one of the crucial preconditions for the evolution of the cooperative social structure in human societies. Now, my view is not necessarily incompatible with this mind shaping, depending on how you understand beliefs and desires and mental states. But on the views that these people articulate, beliefs and desires, mental states in general, are understood in the following way. They are independently constituted natural causes of behavior, right? They are not products of interpretation. They're there in our heads waiting to be discovered, as though we are natural psychologists of some kind. And by correctly representing the mental states people are in, we can then predict their behavior. That's what I want to deny. That's what the mind shaping view denies. And the reason is the problem of holism. So the basic question is, how is mental state attribution both tractable and reliable given mental state holism? And what is holism? It's the observation made by many people, Davidson, many philosophers, that observable situations and behavior are compatible with arbitrarily open-ended sets of distinct mental states. It's hard to tell what someone believes, desires, or intends just by looking at their situation and behavior, since any situation and behavior is compatible with any mental state if we make appropriate adjustments to their whole set of background mental states. Think about deception, differences in beliefs and desires. My colleague Shannon Spalding, or a good friend of mine, Shannon Spalding, in her 2018 book, How We Understand Others, has this amazing discussion of the tragic Eric Garner case. Those of you, I'm not sure if you remember, but Eric Garner was a man, an African-American man in Manhattan who was selling cigarettes illegally, and the police detained him, put him in a chokehold, and ended up killing him. And they did studies afterwards. There's, of course, a lot of video of this really tragic event. And they did studies, and they showed the video to Black and white audiences and asked them to interpret, like, what's going on with Eric Garner? What are his intentions? What are his beliefs? And there were police officers on both, in the Black group and the white group. And there was this radical difference in interpretation of the mental states of Eric Garner. So that the Black audiences tended to say, he's in distress, he's actually not able to breathe. White audiences interpreted his behavior as aggressive, as intending to fool the officer. The point I'm trying to make here is that the same behavior, depending on background, stereotypes, and assumptions, can be interpreted very differently in terms of mental states. That's a very sort of dramatic and tragic illustration of the holism problem. So the problem here is that human coordination is typically rapid, dynamic, seamless, and reliable. So the question becomes, how is the space of possibilities compatible with a behavior winnowed to a correct attribution with neurocomputationally feasible resources, right? Our brains are not infinite, and this happens very quickly. We usually coordinate very quickly. How do we do it so quickly if the mind reading view is right? If coordination depends on coming to an accurate picture of what someone's thinking, despite the holism problem, how does the brain do it so quickly and efficiently? That's the problem. So a nice illustration of this is traffic. This is a incredibly complex coordination problem that all of us usually, tragically not always, but most of us usually navigate quite seamlessly. Multiple anonymous interactants of which we have no background knowledge. Very sparse evidence of mental states, right? We can sometimes catch a glimpse of the face through the windshield, but often not, right? Extremely fraught and rapid, right? You're constantly at risk of dying, basically, in traffic. Dynamic, constantly changing, yet it's, for the most part, reliable and seamless. Now, if you look at the standard accounts of how we're supposedly mind read, it's a mystery how we do this, right? The classic idea of the theory, which was first proposed by the philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, later developed into a whole sort of the dominant empirical paradigm in social cognition by psychologists like Gopnik and Wellman, is that, children and humans are like little natural psychologists that hypothesize unobservable states to try and explain and predict observable behavior. But this can't be literally true, right? Because science, the formulation of scientific hypotheses is a very time-consuming, resource-consuming process, and we don't have time to do it in traffic. Another very influential view is the simulation theory, where we basically this is the oldest philosophical view, it derives from the argument from analogy. We put ourselves in the shoes of the other person, look at how what we would think in their situation, and then attribute those mental states to them. But this sort of, the problem this faces, and it's called the quarantine problem in the literature, is that people differ significantly in their dispositions towards mental states. So how can that be reliable? Finally, there's the idea of module theory, the idea, derived from Chomsky's idea of a language acquisition device, then applied more generally by evolutionary psychologists to the idea that our efficient, quick behavior is mediated by these computational modules that are very fast, efficient, unconscious, almost reflexive. But the problem with them is they have a very restricted set of data that they could deal with, right? That's how modules work. That's where they get their efficiency. But human coordinative contexts are open-ended. Any information might be relevant to predicting what someone will do next. This is a point that the philosophers Curry and Kim Sterelny make in a 2000 paper. So there are problems with standard accounts of mind reading understood as trying to correctly represent the independently constituted mental states of other people, of accounting for how quickly we coordinate. There's a clear, how do we actually do it? Well, this is clear evidence for the mind shaping framework. We do it through pedagogy and we do it through traffic laws. That's how we solve this coordination problem. We teach people to have a second nature, in Aristotle's sense, a set of habits that allows them to coordinate successfully without thinking too much about it, without trying to figure out what other people are thinking. Okay, so this can be, worked into a kind of whole view of human social cognition that's based on the basic idea that human minds are shaped by cultural factors in ways that enable quick and efficient solutions to extremely complex coordination problems. And a sort of corollary of this, or a kind of extension of this, is that belief, desire, intention, and other metacognitive concepts can be thought of as having regulative roles as well as descriptive roles. So this is Victoria McGeer's idea. We are shaped to become better believers, desirers, and intenders. That is, when we claim to believe something, we've been shaped to respect what others in our community think should go with that belief, should go with that desire, should go with that intention. It's kind of like learning a language. When you learn a language, you don't only learn how to predict other people who speak the language, you also make yourself more predictable to them by being able to use a language they understand. Well, I think folk psychology more broadly works in this sort of way. To use a nice quotation from Victoria McGeer, we do not interact with one another as scientist to object, as observer to observed, since the objects themselves, that is ourselves and other agents, are changing under the pressure of the explanatory and predictive attributions that are made to them. Okay, so the basic idea of the mind shaping framework, therefore, is that social cognition and metacognition are species of normative cognition. So what is normative cognition? I'll say a little more about it in a later slide, but roughly it's the ability to learn, respect, and enforce normative regularities. These are socially maintained regularities in group-mate behavior, and they're maintained through sanctioning, like third-party punishment of the sort that we saw in the videos from child development experiments that Mike showed us a couple days ago. So on the mind-shaping framework, metacognitive concepts like belief, desire, and intention are species of normative cognition. They help regulate thought, feeling, and behavior to respect socially maintained regularities. In other words, we police ourselves and each other to ensure that our behavior is consistent with our avowed mental states, according to relevant public interpretive norms. And this is what helps mitigate holism in cognition, in coordination. The holism problem. We don't have to go through all the possibilities because we've been shaped to respect interpretive norms, and the set of possibilities compatible with a behavior or a belief or a desire is much narrower than logic would imply, because it's culturally conditioned in people who interact. And this social maintenance, it's not like you get whipped or spanked every time you do something that goes at odds with a self-attribution of a belief. It's a very subtle. So think of the social costs of acting irrationally or being perceived to be irrational. If one's avowed beliefs and intentions aren't compatible with one's behavior, one will no longer be trusted, one will no longer be attended to. I think those of you familiar with Miranda Fricker's concept of epistemic injustice might recognize that in this sort of phenomenon, where certain people are just not trusted or attended to because of their social identity. Well, one form of this kind of marginalization is when you act too irrationally, when you don't respect the rational interpretive norms of your culture. You won't be attended to. Your status will go down, and this constitutes a kind of form of a third-party punishment. So following up on this means that attributing mental states entails adopting normative attitudes toward the target of the attribution, specifying what she may or ought to do. Attribution to an agent of an intention to do X involves assuming that all else being equal, this agent ought to do X. Attributing a belief that P involves assuming that all else being equal, this agent ought to believe that Q, where P entails Q, ought not to believe that non-P, and so forth. So to say a little bit more about how I'm conceiving of normativity here, it's what is instituted by normative attitudes. And some argue, there's a lot of debate here. I had a debate with Andrea about this a couple nights ago, about whether this is a human-specific attitude. Andrea and Kristen Andrews have a lot of compelling evidence that normative attitudes also exist in non-human primates, for example. But leaving that aside, basically one sign of a normative attitude is the distribution of social sanctions to enforce a norm on the target of the attitude. And third-party enforcement of the kind that Mike was talking about a couple of days ago is a really nice case, because you often, for no gain to yourself and often at great risk to yourself, you sanction a behavior even if it has no effects on your personal interests. That's what that child was doing when they were accusing a child playing a game with another child of cheating in that video. So that's what we mean by normativity. But the thing about mind shaping, what makes it weird, what makes it different from the orthodox approach, is that it reverses the priority of social cognition and normative cognition. The basic idea in mind shaping is normative cognition is a more primitive phenomenon than social cognition. So here's a classic account of normative cognition from Cristina Bicchieri. Preferences for conformity to social norms are conditional on normative expectations, which are what one believes others believe ought to be done, right? So on her view, you have to attribute a belief to someone else before you can understand or respect the norm. And that's the standard view. But on the mind-shaping view, the priority is reversed. That normative attitudes are actually a more basic kind of relation we have to our fellow humans than attributions of beliefs, which are species of a normative cognition. Okay. Now, this might sound a little odd in the context of empirical psychology, but it's an old idea in philosophy. So Wilfrid Sellars famously said, in characterizing an episode or a state as that of knowing, we are not giving an empirical description of the episode or state. We are placing it in the logical space of reasons of justifying and being able to justify what one says. Or we can think of Kripke's work on rules in private language, where he argues that concept use involves an infinite set of dispositions, or a disposition towards an potentially infinite set of behaviors. So if someone uses the concept of addition, right, we can look at all the finite set of sums they have completed. 23 plus 12 equals 25, 6 plus 8 equals 14. But that does not tell us what they will do in the infinite set of other possible sums. And it's compatible with their behavior that when they're given this new sum, they'll give a completely bonkers answer. This extremely large number is actually equal to 2, right? So there is nothing that settles whether they're using addition or they're using this quaddition, this other concept, descriptively, looking at their dispositions or their brain states. According to Kripke, it's a normative relation. It's how you ought to go on. It doesn't describe how the person's actually acting. So this idea that social cognition, that the attribution of states with content is essentially a normative act, has a long provenance in philosophy. Probably the philosopher who has made this most explicit, it's a little bit of an inside joke there, Robert Brandom, is talks about, talks about how attributing mental states, attributing propositional attitudes is like playing a game. It's playing the game of giving and asking for reasons, which means keeping track of the commitments and entitlements of the other players by attributing commitments and entitlements. So for Branham to attribute a reason, a propositional attitude, a belief, a desire, an intention, is to attribute a deontic status. It's like attributing your status as a professor or a teacher. It's a social role that can be tracked and determined by the deontic attitudes of the attributors, including yourself, because you attribute to yourself mental states, thereby bestowing upon yourself a status, which is governed by relations of commitment and entitlement to other statuses. Okay, so that's the philosophical framework. What is some empirical evidence that this is actually describes human social cognition? Well, Mao has some really interesting experiments where he contrasts what he calls reason explanations of actions and what he calls sort of causal history explanations. So a reason explanation is when you explain your action in terms of your beliefs, your desires, your intentions. A causal history explanation, you explain it in terms of something that's beyond your control, like your personality, or the fact that you're addicted, or the fact that you didn't get a good night's sleep, something like that. So he notices there's a very strong empirical regularity where we tend to use reason action explanations for ourselves and causal history explanations to explain other people's behavior, right? I think, when I was growing up, I remember my parents always rolling their eyes when someone from Quebec, the neighboring province, did some kind of crazy traffic move, and they'd be like, oh, those Quebecois, they don't know how to drive, right? But if you do the same traffic move and you're asked why you did that, well, oh, it was the rational thing to do. I had to get there. And so this kind of asymmetry in attribution of reasons is a common phenomenon. Now, one explanation that Mao et al. Consider is that it's just an epistemic difference, right? I know my own mental states. That's why I explain what I do in terms of mental states, but I don't know the mental states of other people. That's why I don't dare speculate. But they controlled for this possibility, and they sort of first came up with cases where someone's mental states better than someone else's, like a family member, but they're not you, and they try to induce that difference, and it didn't happen. If it's not you, you still use a causal history explanation. Then they did another manipulation where they said, well, look at this stranger's behavior. Now try to make it look good. And then they started giving reason action explanations. So they infer from this that reason explanations of actions are kind of serve this kind of impression management function or justification. In another work inspired by a passage that has always inspired me from Bruner's Acts of Meaning, they've noticed that belief and desire explanations are disproportionately used for strange or odd behavior that doesn't conform to norms, right? And their idea is, and Bruner's idea is, that the function of belief and desire attributions is to normalize something that looks prima facie abnormal. It's a kind of social cover where you try to make yourself interpretable to your community after violating or apparently violating some norm. So another good example is the Nobi effect. It's not just social cover. When you attribute a reason to yourself, you incur new responsibilities, which is to justify that reason. And the Nobi effect's an interesting effect you might be familiar with, this very famous result that if you have a CEO who foresees that a policy might have good or bad effects on the environment, but they say they don't care about that. They just care about making the money. If it so happens that it has good effects on the environment, they're not given any credit for it. But if it so happens that it has bad effects on the environment, they're not just blamed for it. It's claimed that they did it intentionally, that they had the intention to harm the environment, right? Even though the behavior is exactly the same. So it's the normative judgment that drives the attribution of the psychological state there. And then there's this long history of the prevalence of norm-inflected scripts for managing coordination. Sort of the idea, Goffman's elevator example that I mentioned, Shank and Abelson, early AI models, which said, you know, when you walk into a restaurant, you don't have to think too hard because there's a script, a stereotypical script about ordering a double espresso or something, and that we've been socialized to inhabit. The philosopher Jorge Luis Bermudez makes a lot of this, and most recently Jen Eichers, a postdoctoral student at Humboldt in Berlin, has a new book called Scripts and Social Cognition, where he argues that scripts also include information about how you're supposed to feel and think about. So think about a funeral. We have a script for a funeral that includes stereotypes about what you're supposed to be feeling at the funeral as well. So another source of evidence, promiscuous normativity. I think Mike touched on this a bit a couple days ago, but basically this tendency to overgeneralize social normativity. I'm not going to go into details, but just citing Schmidt and Rakoczy, it almost seems as if the default assumption of children is that social actions are norm governed unless noted otherwise. In adults, there's a huge literature showing that adults tend to conflate what is descriptively normal with what is prescriptively normal. So for example, judgments about the frequency of problematic social behaviors, a descriptive judgment, drinking, driving, so forth, are positively correlated with their evaluation of the degree to which the behavior is normatively acceptable. Or to quote Celia Hayes in a characteristically pithy formulation, in normative cognition, common is right. So the idea that normative cognition is sort of our default way of understanding regularities in the social world has a lot of empirical evidence. Then, you know, turning to a passage I really liked from Mike's 2019 book. This is a very interesting sort of neo-Vygotskian model of how this kind of mind shaping might take place. Executively monitoring her communicative acts with others is a form of social self-regulation. It begins during conversation that then becomes internalized and plays a key role in the child becoming normatively rational, that is, formulating and expressing her thoughts in ways recognized as rational by her cultural group. So again, a way that we make ourselves more interpretable to others through social interaction, conversation in this case, and then making social interactions even more seamless. There's also a lot of evidence that I'm not going to go into detail about that the attribution of mental states to ourselves, metacognition, is also primarily regulative. There's all the work on confabulation, you know, Wegner's work where you hypnotize a person to move an object on a desk, and then you ask them why they did it, and they immediately provide a reason that can't possibly be an accurate description of why they did it. Similarly, the choice effect, counter-attitudinal advocacy all have this kind of structure. I think as recognized by the philosopher Richard Moran in this wonderful book, if you haven't read it, Authority and Estrangement, I highly recommend this book. He focuses a lot on akrasia. And if you think about it, akrasia, or weakness of the will, it's hard to even make sense of that phenomenon unless metacognition is regulative. So if you fail to act on your best interests, and these are mere hypotheses about the mental states causally responsible for your behavior, then you should revise the hypothesis, right? But that's not what happens, right? I intend not to smoke, and then I keep smoking, right? And I don't say, oh, I guess I must have been wrong. I guess I don't have the intention not to smoke. Because what's causing me to do this behavior? An intention to smoke, surely. No, but that's not how it works in folk practice. We maintain the intention despite the evidence against it, because presumably it plays a regulative role, right? We feel guilty, we feel ashamed, and you know, when things go well, we eventually approximate this ideal. Okay, so that's the mind shaping framework. Now, the big problem for the mind shaping framework is a kind of bootstrapping problem, because acquiring norms seems to require knowing what relevant members of your community believe and expect. How could normative cognition be prior to social cognition? And of course, a lot of mind shaping is language dependent. You know, we have narratives we tell ourselves about the kind of person we are. We try to live up to these narratives. But, you know, on very influential neo-Gricean accounts of language acquisition, linguistic competence presupposes a prior grasp of communicative intentions and relevant beliefs. So to communicate, you must intend that one's target come to believe something by means of their recognition of this intention, right? That's at least 3 or 4 levels of intentionality going on there. So we have these models see that recursive mind reading is necessary to acquire a language. So how can you shape yourself using language, prior to having folk psychological competence? Well, I think I'm going to remind everyone about the false belief task to try and answer this question. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the verbal false belief task, where you ask the child, there's a puppet with an object, puts it in the basket, leaves, the other puppet moves it. You ask the child, the first child comes back, where is the object? And children up to age of 4 famously assume that the absent puppet knows where the object was hidden. They don't understand that the absent puppet would have a false belief. But the sort of most controversial and exciting development in this literature, arguably of the last 20 years, is something that came out of nonverbal versions of the false belief task, where basically what they do, they use this on infants, non-human primates, but what they do is they complete a false belief task with 2 different endings. One where the agent goes where they should go, namely where they think the object is, according to their false belief, and one where the agent goes where they shouldn't go, where the object actually is, where they understand where the object is. And there's this hypothesis in this literature that infants prefer to look at surprising, unexpected phenomena. So it's a very simple experiment. If the one they look longer on is the one they were not expecting, okay? And it turns out they look longer at the case where the agent knows where the object is. That seems to suggest that they expect, at least tacitly, that the agent has a false belief, that they should go where they left the object or where they last saw the object. So this has generated a lot of literature because it seems at odds with the verbal false belief task, where children don't seem to understand false belief until they're roughly 4 years of age. Now, there are a lot of theories about why this happens, but one theory that is relevant to the issue of the bootstrapping problem of mind shaping is the so-called minimal theory of mind theory that it was advanced by Butterfield and Apperly. Let's see here. Oh, sorry. Oops. So there it is, Butterfield and Apperly. They basically say there are 2 mind reading systems. It's a kind of dual process system. You may be familiar with the dual process theories of reasoning, where there's a sort of fast, unconscious, innate process of reasoning, and then there's a slow, deliberate, conscious, culturally acquired system of reasoning. And they argue that the infant data and the chimpanzee data can be explained in terms of this fast, system 1 theory of mind, which does not use propositional attitudes. It focuses on transparent relational states. So having a goal, registering or encountering an object. It doesn't mean that the child has to understand that the subject represents the object in some kind of complex way. They are just sort of coupled to a certain observable situation, and that's enough to explain the nonverbal false belief stuff. So the idea here, and I also think Dennett's notion of the intentional stance can also be interpreted in this way, but the basic idea is that the key is attributing mental states with relatively transparent connections to observable situations and behavior. That would not raise the holism problem, right? If you don't have to take into account everything else someone might be thinking, if these are simple mental states that are very closely related to observable situations, that's a kind of minimal mind reading that might precede mind shaping, might precede norm acquisition, might be sufficient for acquiring norms, for acquiring language. And then you could bootstrap yourself to more sophisticated mind reading that does presuppose mind shaping, right? So that's the idea. And close to the end here, this is an example of such kind of transparent mind reading. So Gergely and Schebra's idea of the teleological stance, very young infants assume that objects will always take the most efficient a path to their goal. So they seem to have this assumption that objects are goal-directed and will take the most efficient path to the goal. That doesn't seem to require sophisticated mentalizing, sophisticated mind reading. So all of this, I want to say, all these sorts of sociocognitive abilities might precede mind shaping and make possible the acquisition of the norms in terms of which I've explained more sophisticated forms of mind reading. A final sort of relevant example is Joël Proust's notion of procedural metacognition and noetic feelings. So here's the problem: is how can metacognition be regulative without first figuring out, what's actually going on in our minds? So Harry Frankfurt famously has this idea that freedom of the will, concept of a person, is bound up with the possibility of having a second order desire to make your first order desire your will, right? So unlike non-human animals, human beings seem to be able to choose their first order desires, right? A lion could not become a vegan. A lion could not adopt the desire that they no longer desire to consume animal flesh, but human beings can adopt desires about their other desires. So that's a form of metacognitive regulation that seems to presuppose a prior understanding of your own mental states. You have to know what desires are and so forth. It's a very intellectualist model. But Proust suggests that we can conceive of metacognition instead as a kind of knowing how rather than a knowing that. So she discusses a lot of evidence from non-human animal psychology and showing that monkeys, for example, appear to have metacognitive capacities. That is, they tend to know what they have seen before. And it's a really interesting experimental paradigm. Basically, the original paradigm is if they're shown an array of objects, and then they're shown a picture of a single object, and then they press a button, yes, that object was on the prior array, no, it was not, right? And they get a reward if they're correct. But if you add a third option, basically I don't know option, and with a lesser reward than getting it right, but still a reward, they can use that third option. And this is often interpreted as a kind of metacognitive knowledge, because they know what they don't know. They know what they don't remember very accurately. But Proust argues they don't need to have a concept of knowledge or memory retrieval in order to do this. What they have are these feelings of familiarity, right? She calls them noetic feelings that support a kind of skilled procedural metacognition, and knowing how to keep track of what you've seen, but it doesn't require a self-concept as having mental states. So the idea here is that when we regulate ourselves to avoid cognitive dissonance, for example, in those examples of confabulation, we don't need to be thinking of ourselves conceptually as having incompatible beliefs. It could be just a feeling of awkwardness that leads us to sort of procedurally regulate our own cognition without necessarily representing it explicitly. So these are some possible mechanisms that could get mind shaping off the ground without presupposing the kind of sophisticated conceptual social cognition in terms of which that I want to explain in terms of mind shaping, if you follow me. I was going to go through some possible applications of mind shaping, but we're running out of time. These are mainly some ideas from chapters in the Routledge Handbook that people have contributed. A really cool idea is conditional game theory, which is a development of game theory by my old mentor, Don Ross, who's a philosopher of economics, which uses a game theoretic framework to explain how preferences might be strategically altered in interaction. So this is a real departure for standard game theory, which assumes stable sets of preferences on interacting agents, right? It makes no sense in normal game theory that you might strategically alter your preferences as part of an interaction, because the preference, you're defined as the agent you are in terms of your stable set of preferences, right? This is a mathematical formalism for modeling strategic changes of preferences in game theoretic interactions. So that's a really cool approach to mind shaping. Another notable thing here is non-human social competence, the role of mind shaping in that, and particularly your colleague, Laura Dannon's idea that conflict management in non-human primates involves certain kinds of mind shaping mechanisms. So post-conflict reconciliation, punishing people who violate dominance hierarchies. These, she argues, are all forms of non-human mind shaping in primate populations. But there's a lot of other stuff, some other interesting applications. The expressions, Colin Finnegan talks about symbolic belief expression online and says that he predicts, he has a model that predicts that social media interactions will make it more likely that extreme beliefs will spread because they serve a kind of group signaling, group affiliation function, and you get this arms race of showing that you're a more solid member of the group. So these are some possible applications. But now, in 1 second, an hour is done. Thank you so much for bearing with me, and please go on.